All right, good afternoon, everyone. If you could please make your way to a seat. We'll be starting the program at noon. All right, thanks. All right, everybody, if you could make your way to a seat, we'll get started here in just about a minute. We've got some open seats in the front. If you guys want to move forward, you're welcome to that as well. In like 10 minutes or less? 5. It's 5 to be safe. Good? Okay. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Yamaha Rightwaters Kenai Classic Roundtable on National Sport Fishing Policy. We welcome everyone here to the Soldotna Sports Complex in Soldotna, Alaska. My name is Shannon Martin. I'm the Executive Director for the Kenai River Sportfishing Association. And the Sportfishing Association's mission is to ensure the sustainability of the Kenai River and watersheds of the Greater Cook Inlet and of Alaska. But sustainability of our salmon runs and fish populations is something that everyone can support. All users of this nation, sport anglers, commercial fishermen, subsistence users, and rod and reel manufacturers, we all share this goal. The sustainability of our fisheries will benefit us all. Today you will hear from Alaskans, but we also have many experts and leaders from the lower 48 to shed light and share knowledge on fisheries issues. These are discussions that are not unique to the last frontier and are not unique to Alaska's tremendous fisheries, but they can influence sport fishermen nationwide. With that being said, we have a lot to cover today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marc Gorelnik as our moderator. He's a member of the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and he's General Counsel to the American Sportfishing Association.
Well, thank you very much, Shannon, for that introduction. It's an honor to be here at this event and in the great state of Alaska. I want to thank the staff and volunteers of the Kenai River Sportfishing Association for their hard work. It takes a lot of work and a lot of planning to put on an event like this and to make it appear so seamless. And so I want to recognize their efforts. A little bit of housekeeping. Yeah, let's. A little housekeeping. When you entered the door and you turned right to come down here, if you'd gone straight, the restrooms are on that hallway. And I'd also like to ask folks to either turn off or silence their cell phones so we don't have any interruptions during this afternoon's event. Let me briefly cover the agenda. We have a keynote speaker, Representative Mary Peltola. We then will cover 3 different topics with a number of speakers, and then we'll have comments from Governor Dunleavy. The 3 topics that we have, the first is a presentation on the Kenai. We have a short film, Rivers Are Life, Kings of the Kenai, and Colleen Litkenhaus of Dow will be our speaker for that topic. We'll next turn to recreational fisheries and offshore energy development. We have 2 speakers on that topic, Andy Lipsky and Mike Waine, and I'll give them more detailed introductions when we come to that. The third topic is how partnerships can support angler access, fish habitat, and improve fisheries. And we have a number of speakers there. We have Steve Cohn, Boyd Lehovde, Commissioner Doug Vincent Lang, and Ricky Geese, former head of this association. After each speaker, there will be a question and an opportunity for questions and answers. And after each panel, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. The way to submit questions is to go to the table in the back there, and Summer is going to raise her hand here in a second so everyone knows who Summer is. And you'll submit your question in writing there, and in particular, if the question is for a specific panelist, please indicate them by name. I think that covers our housekeeping here and an introduction of the topics. And so I think it is time now for me to have the pleasure and honor to introduce Representative Mary Peltola, representative of the state of Alaska in the U.S. House of Representatives, who is our keynote speaker. So let's just take a moment. All right, she'll be with us in a moment. Here she is. So I'd like to welcome Representative Mary Peltola. And she will offer keynote comments.
Thank you. Kind of felt like Bob Barker's, come on down, like running to the stage. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Representative Mary Peltola, Congressman for all Alaska. It's such a privilege to have this job. And the best part of it is not only representing Alaska, but really getting to know all the regions of Alaska. 6 regions, just massive footprint. Every one of our regions is so unique and distinct, and it's been a whirlwind year. It's been almost a year since I was sworn in. I was privileged enough to be sworn in on September 12th, and boy, I lost my breath. We're coming up on that anniversary, and I want to mention a deadline coming up on September 12th here shortly, but I am very thankful to have been invited to this event. It's a classic Alaskan event. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with more fish people about how we can continue our efforts to preserve Alaska's incredible natural salmon runs. You know, my campaign was really one of being pro-fish, and that was a really unifying theme across Alaska. We all have a unique, distinct relationship with salmon. We have so many gear types, so many species. So in Alaska, being pro-fish is serious. And what I found out going to DC is it was a bit of a punchline. Lower 48ers did not understand being pro-fish. And so it was kind of a kitsch thing, but in Alaska, there's nothing more serious than being pro-fish, because that is how we feed our families. It's how we put a roof over our head. And for many of us, it is our identity. So I take being pro-fish very seriously, and that means every user group, every gear type, every region. And our message is resonating. It is getting through. This is the first time in Congress. I'm a member of the Blue Dogs. It's the first time that we've had all the leadership of the Blue Dogs from pro-fish states. It's myself, a gentleman from Maine, and a woman from Washington State. And we share a lot of commonalities in our states with timber, resource extraction, and the importance of fishing. Unfortunately, this year, it does not look like in the 118th Congress there is traction for making a reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens Act. That work was very detailed. Our Congressman Young, was very much involved in the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act in the 117th Congress. He had a gentleman's agreement with, at that time, the chairman of the Resources Committee to work on a bipartisan reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens. And when our congressman unfortunately passed away, that gentleman, Jared Huffman from California, really honored that commitment to Congressman Young and basically put the MSA reauthorization in a parking lot. So when I got to Congress, we picked it up again, and we were only able to get it as far as the House side. We did pass it on the House, but there just wasn't the time or traction on the Senate side to get it all the way through the process. Now, fast forward to the 118th Congress, there's been a change in majorities in both chambers, and there just is not that kind of momentum to tackle that. Magnuson-Stevens was last reauthorized in either 2006 or 2007. I've seen it printed in different ways. And as you all know, in 2006 and 2007, that was a different paradigm. We still had a lot of abundance in all of our regions. We did not see this precipitous decline in Chinook that we've all seen. I think in so many ways, people who live on the Kenai Peninsula are all experts in your own way. Personal understanding, personal relationship with salmon. And you all have seen it. You don't need to see any research studies or scientific data. You can see yourself. Looking back even 12 years ago, we had more 7-year-old king salmon, the large ones. Now they're coming in much younger. We had many, many more females. And there was just true abundance, you know, and I think you all can relate to this. When I was growing up, and even again 15 years ago, my biggest worry was that I was going to catch too many fish and not have enough time to process them all. That has not been a concern, at least in Western Alaska for the last 15 years. Now it's a concern of, I'm only catching single digits when I go out. How am I going to make sure that we have the food in our freezer that we need to make it through the winter? And I know that that has also been the case on the Kenai. So, but in order to make changes at the regulatory level, we do need to have experts and scientists and research and data sets and be able to present those. Now, when Ted Stevens was in office, we had a lot of research funding coming in. And in the last decade or so, that those research dollars have really been usurped by Washington State. The people who interpret how the laws are written, how the regulations are written, and it's not in writing, but the interpretation is that those research dollars are prioritized for treaty tribe states. And those research dollars are prioritized for treaty tribes and Endangered Species Act listed tributaries and rivers. And we don't, as Alaskans, we don't have treaty tribes, and we do not have, luckily, many ESA listed species or regions where that's a designation. And we don't necessarily want either one of those things, but we have to make sure, our delegation needs to make sure that people who are interpreting these federal regulations are really interpreting them the way they were intended and not adding things because there's political pressure from a certain state to funnel those funds. So Senator Murkowski, Senator Sullivan and I, we're very committed to making sure that that Alaskans see more of those research dollars, because the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, ADF&G, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, they really have to see those data sets and the Western science and have it presented in data sets and peer reviewed and all of that, and that takes time. But one of the areas that I think we can see traction on in this Congress, despite MSA not being reauthorized this go around, I think that we can take a look at NOAA's national standards. There are 10 national standards, and those are the guidelines that NOAA uses to make their decisions and make their allocations. And there are interpretations that need to be made within those guidelines. The deadline to comment on the national guidelines and whether those should be taken up, the deadline for public comment is September 12th. And I really am here to ask you to please take the time and make a comment. Alaska is so unique, and our congressional delegation has been telling us for years, people in the lower 48 just don't understand us. The number one question I get from my colleagues is, how long is your commute? And then that makes them feel better about their commute. But there just is not an understanding. I've started saying I represent all of Alaska. Imagine Texas has one representative. Now imagine Texas is twice as big as Alaska, and then add some more. But all of this is to say that all of you have very unique perspectives, unique voices, a unique ability to help tell our story and make sure that Alaskans' needs are being met when we're looking at these federal guidelines, national standards, interpretations. So please, before September 12th, go to the NOAA website and make a comment. And again, that deadline is September 12th. I'm also really proud to say that Senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan and I are taking the pro-fish movement international. Many of you have heard stories about how Russia is funding its war in Ukraine, partly through trawling operations that are selling massive amounts of pollock and salmon worldwide. This Russian fish is supposed to be banned in the United States, but it's often processed and then re-imported through China, allowing it to skirt the rules. The Wall Street Journal has reported an estimated $1 billion worth of Russian seafood made its way into American supermarkets in 2021. That's $1 billion worth of North Pacific fish that could otherwise have been caught by American fishermen, bringing home money on American boats for American families. I can promise you that as long as I'm in Washington, D.C., we won't stand idly by while Russian boats with much less oversight and regulations scoop up fish and undercut our Alaskan fishermen. We introduced a bill, the senators and I, that would ban the import of reprocessed Russian fish from China, and we're working hard to get that through Congress. A little bit closer to home, in the Resources Committee, we heard some testimony. It was pretty alarming to me, and I've partnered with my friend Buddy Carter from Georgia to ensure that NOAA is keeping the safety of mariners in mind when developing rules about vessel speed limits. Some of you may have heard that NOAA had proposed a rule that would have severely limited speeds off the East Coast to protect endangered right whales. And given how many species are listed as endangered near Alaska, down in Washington State, I have worried that it might eventually be applied here as well. And you know, the concern I had is if we're all required on the open ocean to go at 10 nautical miles an hour, if you're in high seas and you've got wind and tide and current working against you, you're probably going to have to go over 10 nautical miles an hour. And so just, you know, making sure that we have as much local control in our state over our resources and our fisheries and how they're managed, the better. This rule could have a major safety, some major safety and commercial impacts, preventing captains from being able to maintain safe speeds or complete the number of trips they need to stay in business. And finally, I'd like to ask for your help as we all continue on working to reduce bycatch. My team has been researching a variety of policies based on ideas that Alaskans have brought to our office, and I want to hear what you all think. On my website, you'll find a survey with multiple different proposals for how to address this critical issue. You can indicate which one or multiple ones you prefer, and you can even suggest your own ideas. Regardless of what gear type you are or user group, we all have to be working together. We all grew up fishing. There aren't many fishermen who it's a one-person thing. It's not like dad or mom goes off fishing. It's a family thing. And this is something that we all want to keep alive, this tradition of fishing. We all want this resource abundant for our kids and grandkids. This is such a huge part of Alaska and each one of us, and we can't afford to stand by and see it diminished. And you know, one of the things that I like to say is, even if we do every single thing possible, starting today, tomorrow, working on it every day, it could take us years and years to get back to the abundance that we all are accustomed to. But it's worth the effort, and we really need to be doing every incremental piece we can until we get there. It's really great to be back on the Kenai. It's good to see my friends, Ricky Geese, so many of you I know from other contexts, but I'm just very happy to be here in this very pro-fish region of our state, and just looking forward to having a lot more conversations with you one-on-one and hearing your feedback, hearing what you think. And again, I am not an expert on fishing. I know a little bit about fishing in one section of one river in Alaska. So I am here with an open mind, open heart. I'm here to listen to everybody's feedback, and I consider all of you experts on the Kenai. So thank you so much. You know, I think it's important to also note that the 2018 Upper Cook Inlet SetNet 2020 disaster, and then the 2020 Cook Inlet salmon fisheries disaster, there should be $9.4 million being distributed from the federal government for disasters in this region. That is not the answer. The disaster funding is not the answer. It's not nearly enough. It does not make us whole. But I just wanted to let you know that the state is still working on that spending plan. And again, disaster funding is not the ultimate answer, but it's a stopgap measure for the folks who really need that for their families. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Peltola. I really appreciate that pro-fish message. And I've worked with Representative Huffman in California, but it's very much a minority voice in California and in the lower 48. And that's frustrating for me as a salmon advocate in California, for which we have no salmon fishery this year. So thank you very much for your comments. We'll get started with our first topic. I'd like to introduce Colleen Litkenhaus from Dow, who will come up, and she has a short film to present and some comments. And then afterwards, we will have a question and answer period. So please feel free to submit your questions. Again, at the table in the back, Summer will raise her hand and wave. And with no further ado, Colleen, please get started.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Colleen Litkenhaus from Dow. Dow is a material science company headquartered in Midland, Michigan for over 125 years. Why are we here? We work with the Alaskan delegation closely for many years on issues related to plastic. We're one of the plastic makers in America. And through the delegation came to know and learn about the Classic here. And I think we sponsored the last 4 years, and someone from Dow, often me, comes and talks about, gives you a little update on what's happening with plastic. One of our initiatives, we started a platform called Rivers Are Life. That's A-R-E, riversaurelife.com, also on YouTube. And we started this platform to highlight river heroes, just to help raise awareness and inspire and highlight those like KRSA and others around the world. It's a global platform who are doing the important work to protect our rivers. So we had the producer here last year, you may remember, and there was some filming on the Kenai, and so we're going to show you that end product. It's called Kings of the Kenai.
My relationship with the river all starts back about 30 or 35 years ago. Few people realize this. If you don't protect the habitat, if you don't have a place for the fish to live, there's no fish. I've lived in Alaska for 71 years, and I'm very proud to say that almost every one of those years I've been fishing. My name is Bob Penny. It's got an E in the name, so I don't feel quite so inexpensive, but Bob Penny is the finest sport fishing river in the United States. It's the Kenai River.
Kenai River is the largest sport fishery for salmon in the nation. People travel from all over the country and the world for its world record king salmon.
I built this house because of kingfishing. I've caught 60, 70-pound kingers right off the front of this house. I'm 90 years old, and I look back over the 90 years I've been very blessed in business and family and everything else. But the driving thing that has been part of my life, and my wife PJ will echo this, is working on the protection of the river. I learned hard way. For the last 3 years, I haven't put a boat in the river here because king salmon are on the downward trend.
Commercial fishing dominated the management plans, and that focused on sockeye salmon, not king salmon. They thought king salmon, well, they're just, they'll always be here. But as we know, that's not the case. And if you look at what has happened to salmon runs around the rest of the United States, it became abundantly clear if we didn't step forward to fight to protect king salmon, they were gonna get wiped out.
I've come to understand from a layman's standpoint of how the salmon act, how they eat, what different things they do. The big ball of grass that you see along the river, that's where millions of baby salmon live on their way to the ocean. Years ago, we counted 5,350 people fishing along the banks of this river. There was no place along the river there wasn't somebody standing. I mean, I didn't know it, and I don't think hardly anybody that went fishing knew it. But our walking up and down the bank did more to hurt the habitat than anything else you could name. All the people fishing here, they walk up and down the bank. And when they do that, next to this big green ball of grass, the people don't mean to, but they create a little path. Then that fall, the water comes down and the ice comes down, gets into that gravel that you walk through, and it expands in the spring, and within a year or so, that great big ball of grass has gone down the river.
The number of people that are going in and out seeking access to that, it's just like a buzz, it's like a magnet. I want to go there. Your brain turns off, and people's brains turn off, and they don't recognize what they're doing if they're trampling these banks, and that's a very protective zone, very important zone for the freshwater stage of the life cycle of salmon.
Without a doubt, is the largest race of king salmon left on Earth. It's a genetically unique stock of king salmon. We certainly shouldn't allow it to just be reduced. This run deserves our best efforts in order to protect it.
I started the KRSA in 1988. We had to do something.
My name is Shannon Martin, the Executive Director for the Kenai River Sportfishing Association.
We're a nonprofit organization that was formed to preserve the Kenai River.
We refer to it as KRSA. It's kind of a term of endearment.
Yeah, we all call it KRSA.
KRSA has contributed significant resources from their annual Kenai Classic fishing event to protect habitat.
The Kenai Classic is one of the most important things I've ever been involved in.
Thousands and thousands of people participate with the Classic. And the funds that we raise are really important because they're the lifeblood of our organization. I used to refer to it as the largest family reunion that we hold each year because so many people come back.
The Kenai Classic is a big event in this community. I think one of the great outcomes of the Classic is it's a great educational opportunity.
I'd like to start by thanking everyone for attending the Kenai River Sportfishing Association National Roundtable.
During the Classic, we would do policy discussions with legislators who would come and with the congressional delegation that would come up.
And at the end of the day, have long-term impact of sustainability for all levels of fisheries.
The business community and the environmental community, they can all come together in support of our organization. And now the Women's Classic and the Junior Classic allow us the funding to be sustainable and to be sufficient going forward.
People come down to the Kenai and they get that firsthand experience. They want to do their part. They want to help conserve. They want to help with the habitat projects that the Kenai River Sportfishing is involved with.
I'm quite certain that without Kenai River Sportfishing's advocacy, king salmon would be enlisted as endangered today.
Our main job is to see that the habitat is protected. Drive down to Kenai Bridge. You'll see just exactly what's necessary to try and protect the habitat.
Part of the work that KRSA does is we install light penetrating boardwalks. And those will allow the vegetation to still grow beneath and help support the riverbank and still allow access to the resource.
State got on the same bandwagon we are. You can't build a house within 50 or 100 feet of the river, and the habitat's protected every place you go.
40% of Alaskans engage in fishing, hunting, and gathering. That's double the numbers of any other state in the country.
And it's really surprising that not more people get involved.
If you don't sustain it, future generations won't have the opportunity to participate in it and to enjoy it as much as we have.
The fishery and the catch of incidental king has gone from 6,000 years ago to this year to 21,000. It's not being minimized, and the department has not done, in one instant that we know of, done anything to try and reduce and minimize this incidental catch of kings.
The Commissioner of Fish and Game has done the proper thing in restricting any fishing for kings. We fought to get that done.
And it means at times that some people lose opportunity to either sport fish or to commercial fish. But if we don't protect all the fish stocks, we all lose. I don't think most people understand what we've accomplished until they get here in terms of our efforts to expand and enhance habitat restoration in the river. You're seeing the banks being restored, coming back to their natural state. The salmon fry, which live along the banks, are prospering. We're really seeing some of the benefits of our investment.
It's really special that we have this resource in our backyard.
and we need to take care of it.
We always say, oh, we're hooked on fishing, but the river kind of hooks you into caring for it. And that's, it flows through you, and your purpose in life and its purpose in life kind of merge together.
This river has given me most of my life lessons. It teaches you how to be a good dad. It teaches you how to be a responsible servant of the resource, a responsible landowner. It teaches you how to be a responsible member in the community. The Kenai River colors every facet of life on the peninsula. It is the heartbeat and the soul of Soldotna.
It sustains the community here. And for me, it's a way of life.
It's just that simple. I wanted to be right here.
Okay. It's a big responsibility to make sure we represent you guys right, so I'm glad to hear you. I hope we did a good job there, and super proud of it, but there are a lot of great videos on rivers, our life, and so they're beautiful. I really encourage you to spend some time looking at some of the other river videos as well. I'm going to get back to Rivers of Life, but I'm going to sandwich this with a little plastic policy in the middle. Just to update you on the international, federal, and some of the state activity. Internationally, I think I mentioned last year that there is a global negotiation on plastic pollution going on right now. So it's the governments around the world are negotiating this agreement. We've had 2 negotiating rounds since last year. We'll have 3 between now and next year. And Dow is co-leading the global plastic makers. We're really hopeful to get this agreement over the finish line. It's not clear the entire scope, but very promising that we could have a goal for all of the governments around the world to agree to have national waste management plans in place and to end plastic pollution by 2040, which we have multiple problems. There's a lot of work to do, but even having national waste management plans will help a lot, not just with plastic, but with all the waste around the world. And so we'll keep working on that and assume that we will get an ambitious agreement with data sharing as well and transparency and parallel tracks for industry and all the stakeholders alongside the work that the governments are doing. At the U.S. federal level, this concept of advocating for countries to have national action plans is also helping at the U.S. federal level to have the U.S. government get our ducks in a row and all of our stakeholders with regards to circularity for plastic and improving our own waste management systems. And how do we move up the waste hierarchy? We have 9,000 different systems in the U.S., and about half the country also doesn't have access to recycling. So there's a lot of room for improvement. The U.S. has a goal to increase our recycling rate to 50% by 2030, and we're currently at 32%. So we're pretty far behind for a developed country. We definitely can do better. But the U.S. government doesn't have a whole lot of authority in place, and so we do see a lot of the states taking action. But recently, the EPA released their draft plastic pollution strategy and had it open for comment period, and I think they got like 90,000 comments. So people are super interested, and we're hopeful that, you know, with their authorities, they'll be able to help harmonize and make improvements. And then at the state level, there's a bunch of different state pieces of legislation that are being put in place in different places. One bucket is recycled content mandates, to say for a certain product you have to have 30% recycled content in it. You probably see the Pepsi and Coke commercials, every bottle back. They really want to get their bottles back so they can use that recycled content to make new bottles. The other is support for chemical recycling or molecular recycling. That's something that the chemical sector is having to scale up, so that we break down the plastic to the basic molecule and start again to make virgin quality materials for applications like food grade, medical grade. This technology certainly complements mechanical recycling, which is more where you don't change the chemical structure, you chop it up, you melt it, and you turn it into something. And of course, we very much want both and need to scale both. Also, bottle bills. I'm 51, so I remember we used to bring our bottles back to Kroger's in Cincinnati and we'd get a dime. So some of the states are passing bottle bills. And also packaging fees, where you put a fee on a package and that fee goes into recycling, so increasing collection, carts, trucks. And we now have 4 states that have passed, have these they're called EPR systems. So industry is working hard to do our part, and speaking for Dow and our part of industry, we spend a lot of time on redesigning products that can be recycled. So making them monomaterial, following design guides, working with our customers and their customers to create packaging that can be recycled, that does have recycled content. We're currently only have about 6% of the recycled content demand is being met. So we're working on that side, and then of course on the chemical recycling side and scaling mechanical side. So Dow has committed to sell 3 million metric tons of circular products by 2030 every year. And so those products are made from used waste and or bio feedstocks. So for example, in Iowa, we're buying corn stovers. We don't want to take the corn because we don't want to compete with food, but using that as a bio feedstock to use less of the virgin resources. In Alaska, we have been funding the work of a company called Pyxera. Pyxera is a kind of a global collaborator, circular enabler, so they'll bring together the variety of stakeholders, which is not something really as a resin producer we can come to Alaska and create a circular economy, but we can, you know, we're trying to help lay the path to pull all the stakeholders together. So Pyxera first did an initial assessment to understand the waste flows, to understand all the stakeholders, how the Native Alaskans are using backhaul, how we're getting waste, hazardous waste, how can we take advantage of the systems already in place. And now they're working on how to create a circular economy for the waste to include the marine debris. And so the concept here is, and there's this facility called CRDC. There's 4 of them. Actually, there's more than 4 around the world. They were funded by the Alliance to End Plastic Waste as pilots or concepts, and then we need to scale them. The pilots are proving successful, and now we're looking to scale them, and Alaska seems like a very good candidate for CRDC. So we created a video for Rivers Our Life, which also just shows this concept so that people can visualize it as we work to bring people together to implement it. And so I'm just going to show you the 2-minute video. I'd love for you to watch the whole video at Rivers Our Life, but we'll just show you a quick little snippet. So you can see Chris Pallister, who leads GoAK, which is they are the leaders in collecting marine debris, all the way through to CRDC, where they use the waste as an eco-aggregator in concrete to strengthen concrete, actually, make it lighter and strengthen it.
From a cruise ship 2 miles offshore, Alaska's shoreline looks pristine, but it's not. It's a hell of a mess up here, and people need to realize that.
Beach plastic is really very difficult to deal with. We need to bite into this problem, and we need to do it in volume, and we need to do it now.
GoAK stands for Gulf of Alaska Keeper. The mission of Gulf of Alaska Keeper is to protect water quality and the habitat and the life that depends on it in the Gulf of Alaska.
The difficulty with marine debris cleanup in Alaska is 33,000 miles of coastline.
90% of plastic waste worldwide is not being recycled.
What do we do with the debris once we get it collected?
We think through our product Resonate, we can actually make a large impact.
We can accept all of that plastic waste and actually convert it into an environmentally benign material.
I remember worrying about the ozone. We got that solved, so we can get this solved too.
So not coming soon, the video is done. It's available for you guys to watch. But I will stop there, and we can have a dialogue. But just to invite anyone here, over the next few days, I'd love to talk to you about the issue. Also, anyone who's interested in getting involved in Rivers Our Life, we welcome collaboration and additional involvement from other partners, and same with the work we're doing with Pixera and CRDC. Anyone who's interested in learning more about that, we'd welcome that as well.
Thank you very much, Colleen. We don't have any questions submitted, so thank you very much. And you will be around, and people can buttonhole you in the hallway and engage in dialogue. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you for the films. So we'll move on to our second topic, which is recreational fisheries and offshore energy development. This is a current issue around the United States, both on the East Coast where we have wind energy and on the West Coast where energy is being planned. So I would like to invite up our 2 panelists for this topic. The first is Andy Lipsky. Andy is a scientist with the Northeast, with NMFS's, or National Marine Fisheries Service Northeast Fishery Science Center. And I'd also like to invite up Mike Waine. Mike Waine is the Atlantic Policy Director for the American Sportfishing Association. So they should come on up, and I'll ask Andy to get started. Again, I'll remind folks, if you have questions, please submit them to the table in the back, and we'll get to them as soon as the speakers are done. So welcome, Andy, and I understand you have a slide deck for us.
I do. Can you hear me? Yes? No. I can also speak loud. There you go. Now you're on. Yeah? Oh, here we go. Thank you so much for having me. I made the long trip from the lower 48, and it is awesome to be in a pro-fish state. I'll just start out with that. So thank you so much for having me. I have a few minutes to share a lot of information. And so I'm Andy Lipsky. I work for NOAA Fisheries, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. The caveat to this presentation is I'm a scientist, and I'm going to talk to you about offshore wind energy development interactions with fisheries from a scientific perspective. My perspective is not about whether we should do this or not do this. It has to do with what do we know about these interactions between offshore wind energy and fisheries. Countries across the globe are now engaged in significant offshore wind energy development. It is not new to Earth. We've had offshore wind energy development for decades in the North Sea, and we've begun to decommission some of those projects even in the last few years. So this is not necessarily a new technology, but we are seeing a massive increase in this technology as countries like the United States and actually throughout the world are pursuing decarbonization strategies. And offshore wind energy is a technology that is being embraced across the globe. So we can see an exponential increase in the last 10 years across North Sea countries and also now beginning in the United States. The war in Ukraine, in addition to further commitments in climate mitigation policies, has really increased the speed, scale, and magnitude of development. And we are poised globally to see a 3.5-fold increase in fixed turbine technology, which I'll get into shortly, across the world by 2027, and a 68-fold increase in the technology for floating offshore wind energy. This pace and scale and magnitude is significant, and will be a major it'll be a major intersection with commercial and recreational fisheries. In the United States, we've committed to 30 gigawatts by 2030 and a pathway to 110 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. And what does that mean in terms of sort of the space in the ocean for these things? In the Northeast, we have about 2.6 million acres that are now leased for offshore wind energy. We have lease areas that were just announced in Oregon. We have leasing that's taking place in the Gulf of Maine. This used to be a New England issue a few years ago. This is now a national issue and a global issue. And you can see we are in the Northeast really ground zero for development. We now have 2 commercial scale projects that are currently under construction off in southern New England where I live. And also we've had one project, a pilot scale project off of Block Island, where 5 turbines have been in place since about 2014. The challenge is to design these programs, this development, to coexist with fisheries and all the services that fisheries provides to us as individuals and as societies, whether it's for food security, culture, maritime history, and all the various reasons fisheries are important to us. And they are, like offshore renewable energy, it also is a renewable energy source. Bottom line up front, to address offshore wind and fisheries interactions is really 5 things that we need to do. And I'm providing this from a scientific perspective. It's critical that we establish the science, data, and planning support for these processes before we have lines in the map. It's very critical that we have capacity to bring critical data from the fisheries resource side, but also from the human dimension side. It's critical that we address the impacts on our science assets. And this is a relatively new issue that has been uncovered with offshore energy. Is our scientific surveys what gives us information on the status of stocks or protected species will interact with offshore wind energy development and fundamentally change how we survey in the ocean. It's critical that we conduct research and monitoring to understand the effects of wind development on the marine ecosystem and invest in research programs right at the start. It's also critical to advance the science of mitigation. the scale, pace, and magnitude of development is going to have impacts on fisheries. Some of these impacts may be positive, some of them may be negative, and some of them may be avoided, and some of them may not be avoided. And it's critical to put these mitigation frameworks in place right away. And the last need I would identify is to identify and fill mismatches in the governance associated with addressing these 5 areas. So offshore wind happens in 2 ways. The first way, last few decades, is fixed turbine technology. Below 60 meters, we can place these things in the ocean using monopiles or jacket foundations. New technologies today now exist, and so it's 60 meters depth, relatively shallow. New technologies advance actually through oil and gas sector, allow floating wind to take place. We don't have commercial scale floating anywhere on Earth, but those projects are fast coming into being. And this basically allows you to install these structures anywhere at any depth. The submarine cabling required for these projects would be through the water column, and the catenary cables necessary to anchor them to the seafloor would also occur in the water column. So you can envision the various types of interactions. Like any energy technology, the technology is changing rapidly. We've gone from very small turbines in the North Sea. If you ever have the chance to fly into Denmark or Copenhagen, you will see the turbines are very small, placed outside in the southern part of the North Sea, and those turbines were like 1.6 megawatts. We're installing 14 megawatt turbines today. Those projects are now in construction phase off of southern New England. These are 1,000 feet at their maximum height, and they'll be placed 0.6 to 1 mile apart. So these are massive structures. You can see for scale the Statue of Liberty next to some of these large turbines. The effects of development will happen across various spatial scales, from the individual turbine level to the wind energy area level, particular project, to a regional level, to the ecosystem scale. However, what we've learned from the North Sea, this is a publication myself and a number of colleagues that work on International Council of the Exploration of Sea, which is an international fisheries body, published a few years ago, identified major gaps in the science. We know a lot of what happens at the turbine level, but because of incoherent science and monitoring and lack of consistent standards, we know very little of what happens even at the project scale, let alone the regional scale or population or ecosystem scale. The types of effects happen over different temporal scales as well. Before there's even a project, there is geophysical surveys that are taking place. Those will occur for 2 to 4 years. There can be interactions with fisheries during the operation of those seismic surveys. When construction happens, it roughly takes about 2 or 3 years. So impact pile driving would be used, lots of vessel activity, and various other technologies to install these. That's a 2 or 3 year construction period. And then we'll have 30 or 50 years of operation. One of the things to consider with fisheries and offshore wind energy is we're adding stationarity to the system. We all know, if you're involved in fisheries, fish move, and the people that pursue fish move, no matter what gear type you're in. We're going to be installing offshore wind, and it's going to stay in one place for 30 or 50 years. So that's a challenge that we need to overcome, is understanding that the ecosystem itself is changing, the organisms change, the human dimensions change, and these structures will be in place. And then that will be decommissioned for 2 or 3 years. So this is sort of the life cycle of a project. One of the issues I highlighted is our scientific surveys. So we have surveys across the country here in on the Pacific and Alaska and the East Coast that form the basis of our management advice. And they're powerful only because we've been conducting them in the same way for decades. That gives us the ability to address precision, accuracy, and timeliness of our information. And it supports all our authorities like Magnuson-Stevens, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and ESA. Offshore wind will disrupt our current scientific survey enterprise. by precluding our NOAA vessels and our aircraft. Our vessels will not be safely deployed to operate our gear in these turbine arrays, and our aircraft will have to fly higher above the turbines. That's going to basically preclude us. It will also change the statistical design of our surveys, the probabilistic survey design models that we've put in place to take samples to say a trend in a population attribute. And one of the key issues is habitat change. And some of the habitat change may be positive, it might be negative, or maybe none at all. But if we're unable to sample in these areas, then that becomes a blind spot for society in understanding what the status and trends of our stocks or our protected species populations are. And then the fourth impact is impacts on our sampling efficiency. In New England, we have low cloud cover. When we're surveying for right whales, we can fly below that cloud cover. When we have a 1,000-foot turbine, there's not going to be a chance to fly below that cloud cover. So we'll basically lose a day of sampling. If we have to circumnavigate large areas, 70, 80-mile swaths of the ocean that now have turbines in them, that's going to reduce the amount of sea days that we have on our NOAA ships, which means decreased sampling. All of these basically mean that we're going to be increasing uncertainty into our estimates of abundance in vital rates of populations that we manage. And that will have impacts on society, whether it's recreational fisheries, or it's commercial fisheries, or it's even other sectors of the offshore wind and energy sector itself. Because if we increase uncertainty on a protected species population, then our risk management policies may put in place more conservative measures. So stock quota may go down, or the allowable takes may go down for a particular sector. The interactions at population level scales can be, at the scale, pace, and magnitude of development are very likely. And the cumulative impacts are very likely as well. We know from the North Sea the types of impact-producing effects have to do with noise from impact pile driving or increased vessel activity, electromagnetic fields for species like salmon that rely on their magnetic compass and their map space for movements and migrations. The reef effects, these may become great aggregation devices. We know that that's the case. So that's potentially a positive impact if it has if it's increasing productivity, or it might be just aggregating fish or moving them around. But these are the different types of impact producing effects. Invasive species, we're going to put thousands of new islands in the ocean, which actually provide a stepping stone effect for different species to move in places that currently couldn't take hold. Entanglement effects, whether it's direct or indirect, with gear getting caught on and potential interactions with protected species. And then obviously the impacts on fisheries themselves, from commercial fisheries or recreational fisheries, which may be displaced from the various types of technologies. I would say that in the United States, fishing like other countries in Europe, which you're not allowed to fish in these areas, that will not be the case in the US. But we may be operationally limited because it may not be safe to practice a particular gear. And then one of the big effects that we don't know a lot about that's emerging in the North Sea is these large-scale wind wake effects. And so I actually have a river background before I went into a marine background years ago and studied the impacts on dams on fish. And it's not just that dams prevent movement, but they actually change the energy flow of the system. You know, the base of the food chain in disrupting sediments and nutrients. Well, offshore wind at large scale can actually have an impact on the oceanography of the system by actually removing kinetic energy and slowing the wind down. We don't know a lot about this, and there's few empirical studies, but some studies in the North Sea have shown major changes in net primary production in the North Sea with the build out of offshore wind energy. Some areas may increase productivity and some areas may decrease productivity. And so what are the consequences of this of changes of atmospheric wind wake and also marine wake effects on populations, whether it's planktonic larvae or the consumers of that planktonic larvae like North Atlantic right whales. Recreational fisheries, we don't know a lot about the interactions. I've fished below some of these turbines off of Block Island. We're allowed to, but we've only have 7 turbines in the water. We don't have hundreds or thousands of turbines in the water. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done before this happens, and mapping and understanding where these and when energy areas may be placed. So better understanding of fine scale positioning for recreational fisheries is key, and understanding what these interactions are. Some of the studies that do exist off of the Block Island turbine, they showed some slight negative effects by overcrowding. We're basically creating a new place in the ocean. If you don't know where to fish, you now have a place to take your boat to. We've started to develop in the Northeast region some data tools that can inform the planning process. This is an example of that. And then, so where we are at, we have reached agreement with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Department of Interior. That's the decision-making agency for offshore wind energy. NOAA Fisheries is a consultative energy. We just provide advice and recommendations, although we do issue the incidental take authorizations direct to the companies for any potential takes for marine mammals under MMPA. So we have 14, this is an example, we have 14 recurring surveys in my region in the Northeast. We are rich in science in the Northeast region. If you add up all the survey years that have been completed, we have something like 600 years of total survey effort across these 14 surveys, bottom trawl surveys in the fall and autumn, ecosystem surveys, longline surveys, surveying sharks, to right whale aerial surveys and marine mammal surveys. All of these surveys will be disrupted. And we've reached agreement with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to develop a strategy to mitigate those impacts. So the bad news is our surveys will be disrupted. The good news is this is a massive chance to re-envision our scientific survey enterprise, and we're embracing that chance now. We're very thankful that our budget included some funds to begin this survey mitigation efforts, but this map, this matrix shows that basically red on here means no, we haven't advanced a step, and green means we're starting to. So my message here to Alaska is you don't have any lines on the map, but you now have a chance to sort of think about what these interactions may be and get your strategies in place so that you're better prepared once development comes. So this is, like I said before, an opportunity to advance advanced sampling on crewed systems, underwater vehicles, passive acoustics and active acoustics, non-extractive technologies like eDNA. We just advanced an uncrewed underwater vehicle to sample our scallop fishery. It's one of the U.S. Next to lobster, one of the big value fisheries in the U.S. It's something like $300 to $400 million a year. That fishery depends on really excellent survey information. So those surveys will be disrupted by offshore wind energy development, but we're looking at using technologies and approaches that can improve those observations. The uncrewed system is now being tested in southern New England today. We're also going to be advancing a recreational hook and line survey, which currently doesn't exist in the Northeast region. So it's a real great opportunity for us to partner both with the recreational fishing sector and also the offshore wind energy sector to advance some new survey tools. So key takeaways: offshore wind interacts with the marine ecosystem, habitat, fish, and fisheries through various impact-producing effects. There are significant gaps in our understanding, and there is serious risk of affecting our scientific assets if we don't think about what these interactions are before we have leasing taking place. And it's critical that we begin baseline monitoring and understanding these areas before lines are drawn on the map so we can make the most informed decisions. It's really critical that these interactions on the human dimensions of fisheries are mitigated, the unavoidable impacts, and there are mechanisms that can be put in place to do so. The other takeaway is offshore wind is being planned and is really imminent across the U.S., and you have a chance now to get ahead on the science and planning of offshore wind energy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Andy, and we have a few questions for you. So we're going to put you on the spot. And some of this you may have touched on in your presentation, but these questions are maybe a bit more focused. What is the potential for habitat creation from Northeast wind projects in square miles or a similar measure? And And you talked about how this could be fish aggregation devices or perhaps new habitat. So what is the potential in a positive sense?
Exactly. So in the Northeast, in that little table I presented that none of you could see, we estimate about 3,000 turbines would be required to reach our 2030 goals of 30 gigawatts. So that's 3,400 new islands across the shelf of the Northeast. So that's new habitat, absolutely habitat. How that habitat will interact with our trust species, we have some ideas. Structure-loving organisms are going to be attracted to them. We did a study that will soon be published off of Block Island using acoustic surveys. You can see the biomass around the turbines that exists. So there could be positive, absolutely positive effects. Understanding the various life history stages and their interaction, and also whether that leads to increased productivity is a big question mark, because like I said, the studies have not been done. They are slowly being done. And we have seen sort of the encrusting communities that will fall off. You know, mussels will soon be attached to all the structures. And that's pretty clearly seen in the North Sea and a whole various sort of disturbance community of biofouling organisms that a storm will come by and slough off and create opportunities for organic enrichment of the sediments. And so some species that are not structure-loving species may also find enhanced feeding opportunities because you're enriching those sediments. Absolutely. The issue that we have is if these areas are unmonitored, as you know, if you may see the fish, we may experience it. I work for NOAA Fisheries, so we get this all the time. But if we get to count them, they don't exist. And so that's a major risk. If we do have positive interactions, we want to make sure that we can account for those increased productivity, and that can have a downstream effect on our stock assessments.
But there have been decades of wind turbines in the North Sea and Scandinavia. Have there not been any studies there to determine whether they're a net positive or a net negative for fisheries?
Yeah, I asked that same question when I first started getting involved in offshore wind, when I worked on the Block Island wind project. I saw a scientist present at a meeting. She now works in our offshore wind group, Lisa Mathrada. She did a meta-analysis. She looked globally across the 30 years of potential literature of any changes in fish distribution or abundance due to offshore wind energy. Over those last 30 years, she was only able to find 11 peer-reviewed studies to draw from. So this is in 2019. And most of those studies had various sampling approaches that were very different from each other. And some of them had not the most robust data collection procedures. But it was one of the things that I heard from actually it was an offshore wind developer from Europe said to me, when we do this in the US, do not make the same mistake that we did in Europe. And that mistake was not getting the science right, not getting the standardizing monitoring, starting to collect the data before the projects get in the ground so that we can understand and fill the uncertainty and de-risk this energy development. Now, that was a recommendation from a developer.
Are there lessons to be learned from decommissioned oil platforms?
Absolutely. Yeah, there was an ICES journal published a few years ago that included oil and gas decommissioning and also the offshore wind turbine decommissioning and what the various impacts of the decommissioning process is. Unfortunately, because we know very little about the role of wind development at a stock level, there's not much you can say about the normal procedure is cut them off at the base, remove them. We know that there's various potential issues with idle iron in the ocean, and if that habitat becomes essential fish habitat because it's been in the water for 30 to 50 years. Right. But there are lessons learned. One of the lessons is we need a little bit more information on how stocks at a population level interact with that development.
Another question. You mentioned that in the U.S., recreational fishing access is not banned near the turbines. I'm not sure that's settled, but we have a question outside the immediate issue of New England, but in the issue of much larger turbines, floating turbines. What's your opinion at the likelihood that these areas will remain open to recreational fishing?
So I'm walking outside of my zone, being from the science side versus the policy side. My understanding is that in the U.S. we will not mandate exclusion other than short periods of time during construction. Having trawled with a trawler right up against turbines in New England, again, it was only 5, not hundreds, and fished recreationally, fly fished, bottom fished on these turbines. I think the fixed turbines, I don't see, it's going to depend on sea state like anything else, you know, and we all have different risk management decisions that we make. The floating wind technologies, we're going to have a web of anchor lines and cables. So if I'm bluefin tuna fishing, sometimes I get to do that, I may, and they may be aggregated to this area and may think twice about fishing in there. But that is speculation. We do not have a commercial scale floating wind turbine energy area. Those will soon be built on the Dogger Bank in the North Sea. We have a 12 turbine floating facility off of Norway and a 6 turbine floating facility off of Scotland. But there's not much you can say about sort of interactions. And fishing is allowed to occur in those areas.
And one last question. What's the likelihood that the development of these turbine sites and soundings and whatnot have been responsible for whale fatalities, particularly the northern right whale?
That's a juicy issue in the Northeast right now. Current evidence is the type of seismic surveying, which is a very low-level seismic survey technologies that are being completed in advance of this development, are not known to have any mortalities or physical injury with and I'm not a marine mammal species. I'm sort of sharing my understanding of what the science is, and so we don't believe there's evidence to pinpoint that they're the cause of these mortalities. There's unusual mortality events for humpbacks and others. That said, we also haven't designed specific studies to answer that question. But based on what we understand of those seismic surveys, and we know a lot about ocean noise from other industries like oil and gas, we don't believe that there's a direct impact. That being said, are there behavioral responses that could be associated with seismic surveys that might be dry? Most of these animals from necropsies have evidence of vessel collisions or fishing or gear impacts, but without a specifically designed survey, I couldn't come up here and say that it's a definitive answer to the question. We don't believe the type of surveying that's done, the evidence wouldn't support direct mortality. Could there be indirect effects? It's possible. The science needs to be done to answer that question.
All right, thanks very much. I think we'll give you a break here. And
yeah, you peppered me.
We'll turn to our next panelist, and then after Mike Waine from the American Sportfishing Association gives his presentation, there'll be a further opportunity for questions. And so again, I encourage folks with questions to submit them at the table with Summer. So Mike Waine, the floor is yours.
Oh, you want this? Yeah. Do you want him to use this mic too? No.
Test.
Yeah.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Waine with the American Sportfishing Association. I cover policy work for our group in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. So a lot of this offshore wind energy development has fallen directly in my portfolio, which got me an invitation to Alaska, so I really appreciate that. And if you're not familiar with our association, we are the Recreational Fishing Tackle Trade Association. We have about 800 business members nationwide. Mainly a lot of the companies that make the recreational fishing tackle that you all use when you go out fishing. So when I was first getting engaged on offshore wind energy development, there was only 15 projects in the pipeline. And so these maps right now show the current state of play of all the different projects across the US. And so the top map there is the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions, and you can see very quickly why this kind of dominated my portfolio. And then the map on the bottom right is the South Atlantic, and even further down is the Gulf, and then bottom left is the West Coast. So you can see that this is progressing quickly. In 4 years or 3 years' time, it went from 15 projects to 50. And each project is at a different stage, and Andy did a good job covering kind of all the different stages of development. Some are in planning, some are in construction and operations. But what's clearly missing from this map is Alaska. And so in preparation for this talk, I looked through some of the information available by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the action agency for these offshore wind energy leases. And what I found was this. So this map shows the ocean planning areas for the state of Alaska. And from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, they have estimated the potential energy from renewable sources across these planning areas. And so the green represents wind energy, blue represents wave energy, and yellow represents tidal energy. And what you can see here is that there's a clear availability of wind resources in these planning areas. And that was the case for us in the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions before we got 15 projects in a really short amount of time. So I really want to stress that there's a lot of movement in this direction for offshore wind energy development. The states specifically are developing renewable energy standards where they're saying by year 2030, 2040, 2050, a percentage of the energy portfolio will be from renewable sources. Right now, the state of Alaska has a lot of renewable energy from hydropower, and I think this figure probably shows what's to come on the renewable energy portfolio moving forward. So this process, the offshore wind energy development leasing process is much different than the Magnuson-Stevens Act process and the Counsel process that I think a lot of you are familiar with. And say what you want about Magnuson, but the one thing as an advocate that I really find effective from that law is you have it as a stakeholder-driven process. And that's pretty different from what is happening through these leases and the different development stages. This is a very kind of wind energy developer-driven process. And we have been advocating that they think through the concerns of the various stakeholders, especially recreational anglers. And so I just wanted to get into kind of what some of those interactions have looked like for us and how we went about doing this. So as you guys know, the rec fish community, very diverse, many participants. We target a lot of different species. Oops. Our data often lacks spatial information, so The different reporting for recreational anglers is different than commercial anglers or commercial fishermen, and the data that goes along with that is different and lacks some of the information that would help offshore wind energy developers or BOEM understand, if we were considering to put wind energy turbines in this area, what would the impacts be to recreational anglers? Often those data sets are not readily available. And so the clear solution here was do stakeholder engagement. And so BOEM's guidance, remember BOEM's the action agency here, BOEM's guidance was to essentially communicate with the stakeholders. Like that seems pretty obvious and straightforward, but it actually has not gone as smoothly as we had hoped. They are required to identify fishing seasons, the types of fisheries that could be impacted, the individuals involved with those fisheries, and describe the social and economic conditions of the fisheries that could be impacted by these projects. The wind energy developers have a certain way of going about that, and we have a certain way of going about that. As I said, we're very used to the Magnuson process, which is very stakeholder driven. And so we're trying to really develop this model out directly with the developers. And so the wind energy folks are not fishery experts, and they are very reliant on the stakeholders to obtain a lot of this information, as I mentioned. And so the structure that has pretty much played out across these projects, and remember, all the different projects that I showed you on an earlier slide, this slide shows you all the different energy companies that are involved in some of those projects on the East Coast. So not only are you're not dealing with one entity when it comes to these developers, you're dealing with multiple entities. And so even though those entities might be all within the same geographic region where the projects are back to back to back, you have different developers. The other thing I'll tell you is the stakeholder engagement model that these developers create is a competitive advantage for when they're going after active leases. And so it creates this kind of strange nature in which you think of kind of stakeholder engagement should be very open and transparent, but when the competitive nature of that model is helpful to then obtaining leases, it can create challenges. So one of the solutions that we thought through was, could we put people that know our fisheries well in positions that would help the developers make decisions that they need to make and make sure that those decisions don't have, or at least minimize the impacts to recreational fishing. And so that's what we did. The developers did create a fisheries team, and we have pushed for those positions to be filled by people that have good fisheries background, good understanding of how our recreational fisheries operate in this region. And we've also encouraged that multiple developers use some of the same individuals, even if there is a competitive advantage to having it be kind of specific to their lease. We felt like these leases are often right beside each other. Those individuals can cover multiple leases, and we can start looking at some of the cumulative effects associated with that by using that type of model. And so the take-home message here is that you want to demand that the developers establish a fisheries engagement team, and you want to be involved in who those individuals are that actually get to do that engagement. So how did we kind of go about this back in 2019 when we were really gearing up and hearing a lot about this issue? And we're still hearing a ton about this issue, as the map shows. So this is our, thanks for that. So this is our government affairs committee at our association. And so we pulled together our Saltwater East subcommittee and just tried to develop a position that helped outline where we stood in regards to wind energy development as this stuff was unfolding in real time. And so it's a neutral position. We didn't take a stance on whether we were for or against offshore wind energy. That's really not what this was about. This is about putting together some specifics that help the developers and the action agency understand what considerations we have as a recreational fishing industry for these projects being developed responsibly. And so the four major areas were fishing access is a big one, as we saw come out in the questions already, scientific monitoring, construction and operation considerations, and then mitigation. So let's get into each one of those, and I will advance to access. So one of the things that I wanted to add to what Andy said, which he communicated that there is no planned restriction on access in these turbine fields. The developers have said that, the United States Coast Guard has said that, the agencies involved here have said that. In fact, I'll even say that the developers have developed a module that and have been inviting anglers, commercial fishermen, boaters to come and use that module, and that module helps you navigate what a turbine field would look like. Remember, we only have 7 of these in the water, but over the next 7+ years, there's supposed to be thousands of them in the water. So the module helps you understand kind of what that would look like in a simulation form. So you can, simulate kind of what it's like anchoring around these and those types of things. So the developers have done some work on this fishing access issue. As Mark mentioned, kind of a model from the oil rigs in the Gulf. And then, as Andy mentioned, there is plans for restricting access during construction phases of the project for safety reasons. And so our advocacy on this has been just avoid established fishing seasons to minimize those interactions associated with any closures for safety. The second was scientific monitoring, and actually this topic has advanced, I think, the most out of these 4 topics. There's a group that was put together called the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. It's a very diverse group. There's about 40 members that sit on a committee there. I represent RecFish on that committee. Andy actually sits on Rosa from NOAA Fisheries. There's all the different stakeholders at the table. And these stakeholders helped the BOEM, NOAA Fisheries. There's a lot of folks from the scientific community and academia. And we all put our heads together and worked on sort of a monitoring framework and guidelines for how to do this effectively. I think the one challenge here, as Andy mentioned, is the timing. You want to, in order to understand what impacts have occurred from these projects, you got to know what the status was before the projects went in place. And you'd like to have multiple years of information to do that. And so if you didn't pick up on that in Andy's comments, that's really critical here, is establishing those surveys early in this area. And that actually, when I did the research for this talk in the Alaska report, there is a lot of information in there saying they need more information about the fisheries and the biology in these areas. And so I would, as stakeholders in this room, I would ensure that they continue to develop that out before these projects come down the pipeline. So yeah, a lot of the monitoring stuff, coordinating with industry, was done through this ROSA, standardizing the monitoring and looking at cumulative effects. As I said, these projects can be located right next to each other. Instead of doing these in kind of a stovepipe manner, we wanted to be able to evaluate cumulative effects across the geographic region, and then also use all available data sets for that analysis. So this figure on the left here just shows one project, and it's only half of their lease area, as you can see. This is Vineyard Wind. And then I just wanted to also show you the cable corridor that is going to be used to bring the power to shore. And so this is the one that's actually starting to scale up right now. I'm from Massachusetts, so I got a few photos from friends where the monopile foundations are starting to go in the water right now. And each one of those black dots on the map represents where a turbine will be located. And so there are several issues regarding impacts during construction operations. The siting and the spacing of the turbines, that's where we've had some input. You know, they've tried to orient the layout so that you know, if you're navigating through the turbine field, the orientation of the turbines makes sense with that navigation. So that has been kind of a stakeholder input part of this. The avoiding construction during fishing seasons I mentioned. The foundation in the scour pad, maximizing available habitat. As we talked about, you know, as Andy mentioned, there's going to be a lot of different structures providing habitat. And so working through with the developers what kind of materials would be best used to make sure the habitat is as beneficial to our fisheries. And then making sure the transmission cables, which are buried along the corridor, are buried to a depth that avoid impacts to essential fish habitat and electromagnetic forces. So that's something that has concerned a lot of folks because, as you can see, there will be many miles of transmission cables associated with these projects. And then the other thing we were suggesting is it possible to run just one corridor for multiple projects so that you don't have multiple cable corridors running all along the coast? You can have kind of one cable corridor and minimize some of the impacts that way. And then also the decommissioning plans that consider the importance of the infrastructure involved in those. And Andy talked about that. You know, these structures being in the water for so long, they will become important to the ecosystem. So making sure that that gets good consideration. So mitigation, this one has been challenging. You know, wreck fish, when you think about sort of impacts to wreck fish, it's hard to quantify some of the impacts that are associated with some of our recreational fishing activity, whereas on the commercial fishing side, sort of gear loss and things like that have been where a lot of the mitigation efforts and loss of fishing grounds because they can't, you know, tow around the turbine area have also been part of the mitigation conversations. For us, we took a kind of a broader scope on this. We talked about supplemental funding to state artificial reef programs. So instead of the turbines just creating such a reef effect and having all of the biomass go into the turbine areas, like could they supplement more near-shore artificial reefs that are already existent or in existence with new material to help provide more near-shore structure so that, you know, all of these fish aggregations don't move to this much more structure-based environment. And then we've also talked about could they create new artificial reefs closer to shore to help keep some of those resources more widely distributed, assuming that reef effect occurs. And then we also wanted them to support a lot of the scientific needs that we heard about with funding from the developers to make sure that there's not a lack of resources when it comes to understanding sort of the impacts of these from a scientific perspective. And then recreational fishing and boating infrastructure is another opportunity for the developers to create mitigation for the recreational fishing community without direct payments to individuals. So just creating more access points and paying for that infrastructure, we felt was an opportunity to bring more benefit to multiple participants in the rec community. So just a quick takeaway. Oh, did that about 10 times. So the way we approach this, we used our position statement as sort of a guiding policy to steer our advocacy work that we use to communicate with members of Congress, the developers, the action agencies, the states. Remember, the states play a critical role here as well. And I think for the state of Alaska, the state agencies will be really critical in working with them, developing, you know, you have working relationships with them for a lot of your issues. This one will be seriously critical to continue to develop relationships with those state partners and the federal partners as well. Develop working relationships with the developers. There's a really clear model. The developers benefit from having fisheries expertise so that when they have issues that they need input from our community on, they already have those individuals that are networked with our community. So that's a really, make sure you really push for those fishery teams to be very knowledgeable. And then this one I wanted to end strongly, demand that the scientific monitoring occur at all phases through coordinated efforts. And that's one take home we really want to drive home is there's opportunity for you guys to get baseline information here. And so make sure you're advocating that that be in the planning process. Because as I showed you on that first slide, there's renewable energy resources here, and I expect that there will likely be development that follows. So happy to answer any questions or talk about any of those issues. I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that information and that perspective. Let me first make an announcement I should have made earlier. There are empty seats up front here, so folks that are standing in back, it's not really necessary that you stand. We have plenty of empty seats up forward. So come on up. All right, so have a number of questions have been submitted, so hope you guys are ready for being on the hot seat. So you've both discussed planning and mitigation. Is there a plan to put all of this together, or is the development by the contractors, if you will, are they really driving this process, as Mike said? Is there really an opportunity to not necessarily put the brakes on, but to ensure planning and mitigation are elevated to equally important topics?
So I'll start, Andy, and then you can jump in. You heard me talk about the states going to bat for their stakeholders. That's where I've seen a lot of this play out, is the state agencies having good relationship with their constituents at that really localized level, and then them developing the state agencies developing working groups that include recreational, commercial fishermen, the wind developers, the action agency folks, and trying to use that model to work through the mitigation and things like that. So that's where I've seen a lot of the progress being made in the discussions about kind of tying all of this together. I think that was the question, kind of how does all this get tied together and where does that occur? That's where I've seen it. The Responsible Offshore Science Alliance that Andy and I are on, from a monitoring perspective, that's where a lot of this has gotten tied together. And so I don't know if you have other things to add, Andy, but that was my perspectives on kind of where does this all converge.
I'll get right to the point and offer an inflammatory remark. Is from a scientific perspective, from the federal side and the science side, it's been incoherent. There are no standards for monitoring. Mike and I worked with a bunch of others to develop guidelines. Guidelines aren't standards. They aren't requirements, and they'll be interpreted in different ways. So the project-by-project approach is leading us down this path very similar to the North Sea, where we have a lot of information being collected, but that information can't be put together. I think there are promising policies that are starting to emerge to address that, but for a number of the projects in like New England, Project A is monitoring and using X, Y, and Z methods. Project Y is using a different set of methods. 1 or 2 years of pre-construction monitoring is insufficient to calculate a statistical mean, pre-construction. Some states have made those requirements. In the Northeast, it's different. We have lots of states that are buying power, and they may have a requirement that says this, and another state may have a requirement that says that. So there does need to be some federal leadership here, I believe. We are, I'm saying that to myself, right? I work for NOAA Fisheries. We recognize that. We're working on it, but there is some problems associated with how we put all this together. And there's lessons learned from other countries that have, paved the way forward too.
All right, thank you. So I guess the takeaway is that planning and protection of fisheries are not really a co-equal goal of these projects.
I didn't say that. Jeez.
All right, another question.
So our goal, the 2030 goal for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy, there's a clause added to that, which is while promoting ocean co-use and maximizing marine biodiversity. So those are objectives of the administration's policies to advancing offshore wind energy development. There are challenges to doing all three of those things, but we can do them. We can design these things to have coexistence.
All right, thank you. So another question came up, and you touched on it. I think Mike touched on it, and then had to do the impact of these transmission cables, the electric and magnetic fields that they'll generate, because they're going to be generating high currents at high voltages. What studies have been done on their impacts, and in particular, and important to Alaska and the West Coast, impacts on salmonids?
Not much on salmonids. There's some older studies on EMF effects on Atlantic salmon. Don't know on any Pacific salmon species, but there are interactions. The studies just have not been completed at the scale where we can make those assertions of, is there a behavioral response? A lot of those studies probably also need to be region or project specific, in terms of understanding migratory routes. The animals can respond to them. I think one of the issues or questions in particular is with the floating turbines, the cables aren't going to be buried. And what we do know about EMF is if the cables are buried and they're insulated, there's very little signal above the sediment surface. But if they're unburied, it's available even if they're well insulated. But that zone of influence is quite small. So it'll be a small impact. There are studies in the North Sea on gaddids like cod and haddock. We have those species in New England. And one of the things that we've recently understood, EMF does disrupt larval gaddid when they're in the water column. They seem to be attracted to it. Low frequency noise from the turbine spinning as well has recently been shown to attract Atlantic cod larvae to those areas. But EMF, in terms of salmonids, my understanding, some information on Atlantic salmon. We are working to develop a research plan in the Northeast, understanding the effects of EMF on the different life history stages of stocks, including protected species. Atlantic salmon is protected under ESA, is a huge research priority for us.
How about crustaceans?
There's been studies in southern New England on American lobster in skate, so elasmobranchs and lobster in situ, and there was some behavioral responses due to an existing cable system. So the animals do react to it. Is it enough of a behavioral response where you're actually changing the foraging behavior or creating a masking effect per se? That type of study has not been done. There's been some studies in the North Sea that have said, no issue here, and there's been other studies that say we've seen a behavioral response on what they call the edible crab in the North Sea. But whether that is a meaningful impact is not understood.
So I have another question here. How deep of water can wind generators be located?
So fixed, it's 60 meters in depth, like roughly 100. They don't want to go beyond that for the fixed. For floating, it's thousands of feet. I don't know if there's, my understanding there isn't really a depth. You're getting into the point of how many miles of cable do you need to get to an offload center versus the depth? But it really opens up, many areas of the marine ecosystem to development.
Is there a notion of whether wind energy, when it comes to Alaska, floating wind, maritime wind energy, whether it will be fixed or floating? Do we know what depths we're talking about at all?
Well, I want to pull up that map and have somebody who knows the water depths tell us better than me, but I assume they're going to be floating.
Yeah,
turbines.
Unless it would be very close to shore. I've been in Alaska for first time for 48 hours. It's been awesome, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on your bathymetric conditions.
But yeah,
and I do want to move here now.
Yeah, so that's the map that shows the potential wind energy resources across the different planning areas. And I assume a lot of those places are deep water.
Yeah, I know for the Pacific coast, it's all floating.
Yeah, the reason I ask is the reference to freedom to fish by fixed platforms has not yet been applied to floating. The Coast Guard has not made a decision on that. So if we have floating wind platforms here on the West Coast, it's unsettled as to the impacts on recreational fisheries. I don't think it should be unsettled, but presently, as far as I know, it is, because this has come up. We've had a lot of discussions at the Pacific Council on this topic. So I don't think I have any other questions, but I would like to give each of you an opportunity. Well, actually, I do have another question. Do the developers have monitoring requirements associated with their leases?
So this is a trick question, because if you go into the record of decision and the terms and conditions of their authorization, there are requirements. But the way those requirements are established is generally the developer has a offtake agreement with the state. The state says you have to monitor, you might not have to monitor, or they have a fisheries liaison. They've met with some fishermen, they've met with some scientists, and they have a project, a monitoring project. They offer that up, and that becomes a requirement. But BOEM nor NIMS doesn't have a decision-making role here. We have a recommendation role, does not have requirements. It has guidelines or best practices. So it's kind of like a one-word response, I would say no.
Okay, fair enough. And what are your research priorities that haven't yet been addressed?
When I was in Bremerhaven, Germany, before COVID, and a researcher by the name of Karina Scrum showed me that picture of the windmills with the fog banks coming off of them. And then she showed another picture of net primary productivity in the southern part of the North Sea changing by 5 to 10%. And this is not that long ago, and I didn't even think about that. No one was thinking about that. Even in Europe, they weren't thinking about that, but this group of engineers was thinking about that. And that's a massive potential change to the ecosystem. That's what keeps That's like one of those research things that keeps me up at night, is like, let's nail this down and figure it out. That's a major, but there is so much uncertainty across all those impact producing effects and those responses on our trust species, whether they're salmonids or they're groundfish or they're like humans, our fisheries themselves. We don't know. They're all priorities. We recently published a paper in American Fisheries Society, myself and about 4 other authors from NIMS in the Northeast region, and we wrote up what our research priorities are, so you can view that publication afterwards if you want to read it.
If you can provide that citation.
Absolutely.
Because you know, on the West Coast, the California current ecosystem is the driver of marine productivity, and that in turn is driven by upwelling from the prevailing northwest winds. We have an impact on that. We're going to have an impact on productivity. So
there was a recent study looking at upwelling disruption from some of the projects off of California, and they did show that there was changes. Now, just because there's change doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, right? Like some change could be good, some change could be negative. So so this disruption, maybe you're like we're putting windmills in like one of the most important areas for North Atlantic right whale winter foraging off of an important oceanographic feature. Maybe we are going to create a great place for calanus, zooplankton species. That's why the whales are there. They're feeding on calanus. Maybe it's a good thing. Nonetheless, it's a disruption of the marine ecosystem. So understanding that disruption is really key.
All right. Any last comments from Mike or Andy? I gather not. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you all for inviting us.
And I'm hoping there's lessons there for Alaska, because it's, as Mike said, it's coming. So we're going to move on to our last panel of the day. So I'd like to invite up Steve Cohn, Boyd Lahovde, Commissioner Doug Vincent Lang, and Ricky Geese. And the topic here, as a reminder, since it's been a little bit, is how partnerships can support angler access, fish habitat, and improve fisheries. And as we have for the prior panels, if you have questions, please submit them to Summer at the back table. So first we're going to have Steve Cohn from the Bureau of Land Management, followed by Boyd Lahovde from Fish and Wildlife Service to talk about the Gravel to Gravel initiative. So, Steve, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Cohn. I'm State Director for Bureau of Land Management here in Alaska. Bureau of Land Management implements our multiple use and sustained yield mission across more than 70 million acres of public lands here in the state, including close to 177,000 miles of stream habitat. We do not manage a lot of land here in South Central Alaska, though we do have significant subsurface management responsibilities here in the Kenai Wildlife Refuge. But certainly I appreciate the opportunity to see you all here today to talk about aquatic habitat restoration, projects that we're working on around the state with many partners and many folks here in this room, and to talk a little bit about some of the new funding sources that have helped us to make, I would say, accelerate our progress on restoration in the state. BLM, as a multiple use agency, does everything from permitting for resource development. We do active conservation work and a lot of work to support recreation and access for hunting and fishing. So in many ways, we're, I think, an agency that has a big role in supporting the Alaskan way of life and the outdoor recreation economy. As a key land manager for many upland and headwater areas, BLM has a long history of habitat restoration work in Alaska. In particular, over the last decade or so, we've been working with a lot of stakeholders and partners to really improve our stream restoration techniques and outcomes. Thanks to major investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we are expanding this work to a new scale with a headwaters to ocean approach, or something we've been referring to as gravel to gravel, to address the salmon crisis, particularly facing interior Alaska as well as the Arctic rivers. To date, we've received about approximately a little over $4 million in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and another $1.5 million in the Inflation Reduction Act, focused on stream restoration. As we all know, it's all hands on deck when it comes to restoring habitat for fish. This funding's allowed us to build close partnerships with other federal agencies, Alaska Native tribes and organizations, organizations like Trout Unlimited, and state agencies, Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, Department of Natural Resources, Soil and Water Conservation District, really amplifying our strengths and expertise. And we all know that fish don't recognize land ownership. And so it's really partnerships that are going to be critical to our success moving forward. We are currently scaling up our restoration work thanks to the support of these kind of funding sources and, again, these long-standing partnerships. We're doing a lot of work in the 40-mile Wild and Scenic River, the headwaters of the Yukon, Yukon drainage, Birch Creek and Beaver Creek, all three wild and scenic rivers in the interior. And we continue to build our expertise and leverage our partnerships to continue to increase our success with habitat restoration. Just last week, I was able to take a tour of one of our project sites. It's an area called Nome Creek. It's about an hour and a half from Fairbanks. It's in the White Mountains National Recreation Area. And as sort of a first step, we've restored about 1,000 feet of that stream, some of the most heavily impacted parts of that stream, but looking to restore up to 8 miles of stream, basically all upriver of Beaver Creek Wild and Scenic River. And it's a really amazing fishery. I mean, it's very accessible, it's road accessible, and it's potentially could be one of the most important grayling catch and release fisheries in the state. And that project was made possible through a partnership with the Salcha Delta Soil and Water Conservation District, and an arm of, of the Department of Natural Resources. And yesterday I was able to take a tour of a couple of sites in the Copper River Basin. One of those, the Little Tonsina Creek, is a restoration project for fish passage. And that one structure that we were able to restore, it's a couple of culverts that were blocking the stream. We were able to replace that with a sustainable bridge. Will open up access to 70 miles of upstream Chinook habitat from one project. And this was actually the first bipartisan infrastructure law ecosystem restoration project in the country. So, I think we're learning a lot about stream restoration. I think in the past we're really reliant on natural processes to restore streams, but they can take a long time. And so we're finding that with investments, with new techniques, we can really accelerate the pace of stream restoration. And we're excited about that. I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Boyd, why don't you go next, and then we'll have any questions on this subsection of the topic.
Thank you, and thanks, Steve. My name is Boyd Blahovdy. I'm a Senior Advisor for Conservation for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Alaska region. I'm filling in for Sarah Borio, who's the Regional Director for Fish and Wildlife Service, and apologizes that she couldn't be here today. I want to start by saying thanks to KRSA for everything that you do, and for all of you local folks who take care of the Kenai River. and conserve and manage that river. I appreciate everything that you do. Also, just want to acknowledge thanks to Representative Peltola. It's hard not to call you Mary, but Mary, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. It really means a lot, I think, to everybody that you would show up and attend. And then also want to acknowledge Andy Loringer, if he's in the room. He is the refuge manager at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, and I wanted to just recognize him and the whole staff at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge for doing what they do to also protect the Kenai River and provide access to all the sports fishermen and women in the room and around the state and the world. So yeah, thank you. I'm going to skip over some of the things that I was going to say because Steve did a great job on explaining some of the Gravel to Gravel initiative, but I just wanted to provide some more information to kind of fill in some of the gaps for Fish and Wildlife Service at least. And it's safe to say that there's a lot going on right now with legislation, new legislation like the bill law. It's the bipartisan infrastructure law we call bill. It's provided for ecosystem restoration dollars in Alaska that are supporting at least 3 fish passage related projects. There's the America the Beautiful Act dollars available each year through NIFWIF. And then there's the Gravel to Gravel initiative that Steve mentioned. I'm going to just bring that up again in a little bit. But there's also the Inflation Reduction Act Steve mentioned. That's given a significant boost to other infrastructure projects, which Steve spoke to, like restoring mining impacts to Alaska rivers across Alaska, but in particular, we're focusing on the Gravel to Gravel geography. I just want to underscore that all the projects and all the legislation work that's being delivered in partnership, it's being delivered in partnership with many across the state, including the state of Alaska, ADF&G, and others. So Bill and Inflation Reduction Act together have contributed to a new initiative for the Department of Interior. Like Steve said, this Keystone initiative is one of 9 across the country. It's the only one in the state of Alaska for the Department of Interior called Gravel to Gravel. It focuses on where life begins and life ends for salmon. However, this initiative is more than just salmon conservation. It's going to focus on ecosystem and habitat restoration across that geography. And if you do have a way to pull up the website, at least for Fish and Wildlife Service, this is a website you can go to find out more. I also have fact sheets here that if you'd like, I'll leave them with the organizers. Maybe they'll be in the back of the room to share with more information. The Gravel to Gravel initiative hopes to invest in co-stewardship with tribes in the Yukon, Kuskokwim, and Norton Sound region, restore degraded streams, expand habitat assessments and practices, replenish native vegetation, and study salmon productivity, health, and survival. Larger ecosystem threats are also a focus of this initiative because we know wildlife depends on healthy habitat. So this is my second week in this position as a Gravel to Gravel coordinator, and this is my initiation, I suppose. And this month, new in this position, I focused on coordination and coordinating with partners, but also with submitting projects under the 3rd phase of the Bill Ecosystem Restoration dollars that were available. We did propose roughly 20 projects for the whole state of Alaska. At least one was here on the Kenai Peninsula. So those proposals did not have to be specifically in the geography, which is hard to tell though, but it's the purple, mainly the purple area there in the state of Alaska. They could be from anywhere in the state of Alaska. So we did propose with Fish and Wildlife Service about 20 projects. There was about $33 million available for Gravel to Gravel funding. Just to close, I want to say with Gravel to Gravel investments, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is actively supporting and funding through these opportunities a variety of projects that will ensure safe, resilient, and equitable futures for people, salmon, land, and waters. The effort to conserve salmon in Western Alaska will benefit not just wildlife, but people that depend on them. All fishers will benefit from healthy salmon populations.
And one day it might even result in reduced regulations and restrictions on fishers like all of you and for your future generations. So I think that's enough. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Boyd. I don't have any questions right now, but I think we'll have questions at the end of this topic. I'd next like to turn to Commissioner Doug Vincent Lang of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to speak about federal funding.
Well, hello? Can you hear me? Okay. I guess I was unprepared to talk about federal funding initiatives here, but I'm going to talk about partnerships. You know, everybody, when I took this job, everybody said, you have a responsibility over fish. Well, what I do have is an understanding that fish are everybody's in this room. They're not mine. I just am entrusted as an agency head in managing them in the public's best interest. And to do that, it basically requires partnerships. We can't do this alone as Fish and Game. We can't do this alone as federal agencies. We require and we need public involvement in ensuring sustainability of our resources. This requires involvement at the regulatory level, both at the local AC levels or RACs at the federal level. It requires it at the state level through the Board of Fisheries, and requires it at the federal level through the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. And I think what we're also seeing, it's requiring at the international level. We can't simply just regulate fisheries at the state level any longer. Our salmon run out into the international waters, and we need to be involved with how Russia and other jurisdictions in Asia are potentially intercepting our fish. We also need to have partnerships at the research level. Again, Fish and Game can't do this all alone. We've done a pretty good job of managing escapements into river systems, but clearly now we need to partner at the international level. We pretty much all agree that we're having issues out in the ocean. And Fish and Game doesn't have the capacity to get out in the deep blue ocean to understand what's happening out there. Last year, we contributed over $1 million in different research entities to start understanding what's happening in the deep blue ocean out there. We participated in the International Year of the Salmon. It's going to take more of those kinds of partnerships across different groups to try to understand what's happening in the ocean. And it's going to require partnerships with fishing groups like Kenai River Sportfishing Association, you know, who's putting on this and who's keeping the metal to the pedal to the metal on habitat issues in the Kenai River and the fate of king salmon in this river. And with UFA, our commercial fishing brotherhood that fishes for these stocks and cares deeply about them. And then it's going to require really partnerships at the individual level with fishermen. I know a lot of times I hear from a lot of different fishermen about their thoughts on fisheries. Sometimes I wish they expressed it a little bit more kinder, but the good point is that they care enough to call and they care enough to be involved in fisheries. So in short, we need partnerships. We can't do this alone, and we must, if we're going to have sustainability, involve everybody in that thing. Because if not, I think we all know what happens when people stop caring about resources. When people stop caring, money from Congresswoman Peltola doesn't come our way because people no longer are calling their offices to get money for ensuring sustainability of those resources. The gravel-to-gravel assessment. I know we had put out a gravel-to-gravel assessment about a year ago. We're fully supportive of doing that. We look forward to partnering with you in terms of getting some additional information on gravel-to-gravel. We do a pretty good job of counting adult fish in the rivers, but we really don't have a very good idea what's happening to juveniles within the river and then the fate of juveniles as they emigrate out to sea. That's going to require, a partnership in trying to understand those questions moving forward. It's also going to require responsible management. Sometimes responsible management is a tough pill to swallow. It requires, in the short term, restrictions or closures to fisheries. And that's a tough pill to swallow. We haven't had recreational fishing for king salmon in this river for years, and now that pain is being felt on the marine waters in our east-side set net fisheries and to a certain extent other fisheries. So I know it's a tough pill to swallow, but if we're going to have sustainability, we're going to have, for future generations of our fishermen, we're going to have to take some short-term pain. But again, I want to thank you all for your engagement. And if I can leave you with one message at the end of the day, stay engaged. Your voice matters. Your voice and your participation is the only way that we're going to ensure sustainability of our fisheries. One thing I know Representative Peltola spoke about is the national standards. I encourage you all to participate in that process. And the state of Alaska has asked NIMS to consider extending the comment period, because the comment period runs during the time when most of you are out fishing. And in Alaska, that's pretty much the summer period. We've posted our comments on our website to help you understand what some of the concerns the state may have with the national standards, but that's an opportunity for you to get engaged in how we're going to deal with issues like climate change and other things moving forward in terms of sustainability of fisheries. So bottom line, thank you for everything you do for this river. Thank you all for staying engaged and caring to show up for meetings like this, but please stay engaged.
Thank you very much. I don't have any questions right now, but I'm hoping we'll have some at the end of the panel. Next, I'd like to turn to Ricky Geese, the Director of Alaska State Parks.
Hi, thanks everybody. It's an honor to be here as the Director of the Division of Parks and Outdoor Recreation for DNR, and it's great to be sitting next to Commissioner Lang here from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I don't think we have a tighter partnership with any other department in the state between us for recreational management and outdoor recreation. So, as a prologue, I'll just provide great conversation today. A lot of different topics. Really appreciate the Classic Roundtable. Really appreciate the sponsors that continue to support this dialogue in our state. 3 takeaways, I think, as a state for Alaska, that this conversation we can use as models. One is Commissioner Lang is a part of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. I think it's really a great model to talk about stakeholder engagement in processes such as the offshore wind development and the impacts that could occur. There's a process there in terms of a science and statistical committee, a stakeholder group, and then agencies which use all that input to come to responsible resource management decisions. Within the Division of Parks and Outdoor Recreation, in our Office of Outdoor History and Archaeology in the State Historic Preservation Office, there's also a really good example and model that we can draw from. It's a database-driven model. OHA is responsible for the Alaska Heritage Resource Survey. It has over 50,000 database points across the state, which talks about the important historical and cultural artifacts in our state that's important. And every development project in this state has access to that and is required to look at that when they do development projects in order to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the impacts of development. And a similar situation seems to me occurs here with fishery impacts. And lastly, one I'm going to talk about is the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Doug also sits on the trustee council, and that's been over 30 years, and that's been a mitigation fund from the oil spill from the late 1980s. And that fund has produced money and research primarily for the impacted oil spill areas, primarily Prince William Sound and the Gulf coastline. But they have 2 components too. One that we've been talking about today, the importance of scientific research, long-term data sets, and the other one was for habitat preservation and recreational or projects that improve access for the recreational communities. So I think as a base, Alaska, we have models to draw upon that I think put us in a strong position moving forward as these opportunities come to us. The Kenai River Special Management Area is one of the most visited public lands in Alaska. We just finished our statewide outdoor recreation plan, and part of that was doing research and monitoring to see where the Alaska public and visitors go in Alaska. The top public land visited in Alaska is Chugach State Park, and most of the visitors to that park come from Anchorage, which is not surprising. It's the largest population center that we have in the state. Second most visited area is Mendenhall Glacier, primarily cruise ship travelers. Everybody, on a cruise ship stops in Juneau and goes out to see Mendenhall Glacier. The third most visited public lands in the state for outdoor recreation is the Kenai River Special Management Area. And so that's a big responsibility. And we have a tight partnership, like I said, with Fish and Game. They're responsible for the fisheries management of it, putting fish in the river, monitoring, and we're taking on the responsibility for managing the access to that river for public access. And then also we have about 350 guides who make their living and their vitality off of that through our commercial use permit program. So, do we have the slides? Do we give them slides? Or? Do we have, for the EVOS partnership, did you guys have that? If not, I can just talk about it. So the EVOS partnership and the Parks partnership dates back a long period of time through the since the beginning of the establishment of the EVOS program. About $16 million has been invested over the 30 years of the EVOS program in the Alaska state parks. Much of that in the 1990s went to help build out in Prince William Sound the Alaska State Marine Park system that we have in Prince William Sound. It also helped provide access, angler access, and boating access on the Kenai River here. The EVOS funds is drawing down, and the last of the investments from that funding source is being made. So two major projects are occurring that I would like to share with you. One is at Big Eddy State Recreation Site off of Big Eddy Road just outside Soldotna. And the other one is at Eagle Rock with the purchase of the bookie parcel and planned development for additional parking for that area there. So for the Big Eddy State Recreation Area, as mentioned in the film for the Rivers of Life, there can be at any one time from the mouth of the Kenai River up from the Warren Ames Bridge, which is about River Mile 5, up to Ski Lac Lake. It's about a little less than 40 miles of river where people can go bank angling. And you can have, more than 5,000 people on any given day in the river fishing primarily for sockeyes as a bank fishery. 5,000 people, that's a lot of access points, that's a lot of places where cars are parked and parking lots and people moving along the riverbanks, the important riparian habitat. That riparian habitat, as the film showed, so eloquently talked about the importance for juvenile salmon habitat. It's really important that we do that. And through the Board of Fisheries process, I see we have a couple Board of Fishery members here. Not very many people know, but half the lower Kenai River from Ski Lac down to the mouth of the Kenai is closed to bank fishing. So only about half of that available area is available to anglers. So any place where we can improve the access for bank anglers is really important. And what's really cool about the Big Eddy State Recreation Site, the improvements are going to go on. It's a partnership with Kenai River Sportfishing Association. It's about, it's a $4.3 million project. It's going to put in walkways, much like behind here at the Soldotna Sports Center that the city of Soldotna has put in, where if you follow anglers, anglers will walk about 100 feet, and if they see an access point, they'll follow a walkway and access the stairs into the river system. If it's longer than that, they said, I can't see anything. I'm going to start doing, just walk wherever. And then those trails become established and they become a habitat concern. So the property we're developing, we can fit in 4 to 5 new access points, one main corridor, and then feeder trays, and then stairs going into the river system. And we're developing a new parking lot for cars so it doesn't impact the local community. And then we're also paving a road that goes down for folks who are participating in the Classic. You will experience the joys of unpaved travel in Alaska with potholes and washboards. So as much as possible, where we can and when we can, we try to bundle projects with pavement, both for our parking lots and our roads. Next up, what we're going to do as a project is Eagle Rock is a famous landmark, probably the most famous landmark on the lower Kenai River. And the lower Kenai River, in terms of boat fisheries, in July, when it's at peak season, will support an active personal use dip net fishery. At the mouth of the Kenai, you'll have up to 400 or 500 motorized boats there. When the king salmon season is popping, you can have 400 to 500 boats on the lower Kenai up to the Warren Ames Bridge here. And then we can also have, more importantly, sockeye salmon really moving forward. So this is going to establish parking on the up to 70 new parking spots for trailers. Yeah, 70 new parking spots for trailers. You can see where people park along the Kenai Spur Highway right now. There is, you'll have up to 50 to 70 trucks and trailers trying to cross the 2-lane highway now. Road construction happens next summer, and that's going to move to a 5-lane highway. So we really don't want to put anglers at risk trying to find additional parking. The current footprint at the Eagle Rock boat launch has about space for about 30 boats, trailers, and this will kind of triple that capacity. So this is a really much needed project. This is a project that Kenai River Sportfishing Association also advocated the initial project approval through the EVOS Council. And another great example of why partnerships are really needed in our state to provide recreational anglers for access and then habitat protection.
All right, thank you very much, Ricky. Thanks to the panel. I understand there are some questions coming forward. The envelope, please. All right, I'm going to take these in order. First, have a question for Commissioner Lang regarding public engagement. Public perception of headlines may not always match data and established management practices. Can you speak to how you weigh public engagement versus staff recommendations in preseason and in-season management?
Oh, boy. Well, I have taken a lot of phone calls all summer long about fisheries management, especially in the Kenai River. I weigh those all, and I take what I also take from staff and the technical information that's coming our way, and then we have to make judgment calls to ensure that we're making, getting fisheries in the water where we can, and we manage based on allocation decisions that are provided to us from the Alaska Board of Fisheries, which sets the allocation schemes for Cook Inlet, and then in season we're balancing data versus public perceptions and needs, and trying to manage for sustainability. So, yeah, it's an art as much of a science, but I can tell you, we do seriously take public comment into consideration as we manage these fisheries. So, I know a lot of people don't necessarily agree with all of our decisions, but they do factor into how we do make decisions. And please don't stop calling, because once again, people stop calling, people stop caring, and that's not a good outcome. So it's really important to understand how people believe these fish should be managed, and how we should be working towards their sustainability in the long term.
I know that hard decisions are hard to make, but sometimes you have to make hard decisions. So here's a question for Director Gies. It is clear that Alaska State Parks are underfunded, facilities, parking areas, and boat launches in disrepair across the state. Is there any chance of increased funding to address this gap?
Great question. I think I've been touring many of our facilities with Commissioner Boyle, and it's, you know, we do need investments, and for facilities, many of which were designed in the 1970s and 80s. And, you know, at times you get to the point where things need to be repaired, and then there's a replacement. We rely heavily for boat launches with the Sportfish Restoration Fund. We have a close relationship with the Department of Fish and Game for boating access projects. Over time, though, when you make those $1 million to $2 million investments per year, the next generation needs to be funded in addition to what you funded for 20 to 30 years. So we're kind of getting to that point in the state where many of our boat launches and access points that are important transition points from land to get onto the waters and the lakes that we use for recreational fishing, that they need some funding attention. And thankfully, my job is not figuring out where all the funding goes. You know, that's up to the legislature at the end of the day to come up with those strategies that make investments in our state.
All right, thank you very much. I have a question for Commissioner Lang. I guess making yourself publicly available, we have a lot of questions. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game has taken numerous extreme measures in an attempt to conserve kings in the Kenai this year. From no in-river fishing, no marine fishing, no set nets. Has it produced any results so far?
Well, I think I looked at the data this morning. We have made the sustainable escapement goal that the department has figured out is necessary to sustain the population over the long term. So without fishing, we were able to make that sustainable escapement goal. Now it's up to the Board of Fisheries, who's going to have a meeting next February. And again, there's a couple Board of Fish members in the audience here. They're going to be weighing, again, how we manage these fisheries for the next 4 years after this board meeting. And I encourage you all to stay and get involved in that meeting, make your voices heard. You don't necessarily have to show up. There's opportunities to provide written comments. All those comments are read. I read them, and I know the board members read them. This is your opportunity to weigh in on how those fisheries should be managed and rebuilt so that we can get king salmon back in this river that are sustaining not only in-river fisheries, but also sustaining set net fishery opportunities as well as other commercial opportunities throughout the inlet. So weigh in. Again, this is a partnership, the public-state partnership. We need people engaged in those regulatory systems so that they work and your voices can be heard in the development of those management plans.
All right, thank you. We'll turn back to Ricky here. After purchasing the old Castleoff property 10 years ago to address the safety concern, the state has yet to move forward with any development. Can you provide an update?
Sure. So the old Castleoff Landing was the site of one of the private takeouts on the lower Castleoff River for drift boats. Castleoff River is managed primarily as a drift boat fishery, and as state parks we operate one of the two boating access points to enter into the fishery, the other one being in the wildlife refuge up at Tustamina, but the bulk of the entries happen at the Castleoff River. And then Trujillo was one of the two private takeout locations. Trujillo retired, and there was a gap in where people could take out. So the legislature supported funding for property purchases. Those were done with two properties because one of the comments from the public was, you know, we don't want parking to spill out into the subdivision, you know, any of the local communities, and that's something we hear a lot with parks, and, you know, we don't have adequate parking. So through the public process, additional funding was secured to buy two parcels that were back to back. One was the Trujillo property, one was the Kimbo property. So now there's 10 acres. That site location likely is going to go to construction next summer. And we'll have close to 50 parking spots there for truck and trailers to access a drift boat only pullout for the lower Kasilof River.
All right, thank you very much. I've got 2 more questions here. They're both for Commissioner Lang. But only 2 more questions, so. The first question relates to, I guess, monitoring. Is there more money for additional sonar units at the mouth of the Skilak and the mouth of Kenai Lake?
Right now, there is no money for that. We are confident in our ability to count large kings at the current sites, so it's not a #1 priority of the department to install additional sonar counting sites into that river. That's not, I think a higher priority of research in the Kenai River is understanding what's happening to juvenile salmon in that river. New technologies that are under development in the Columbia River, especially the Bonneville dam system, we're now able to put pit tags into juvenile salmon and accurately assess their movements throughout the Columbia River system. We're looking to employ that technology now into the Kenai River to understand where our juvenile salmon are residing, what type of mortality they're suffering over a course of a summer and winter. And more importantly, we may be able to begin to assess with some nearshore marine work what's happening to these juveniles after they immigrate out to sea. A lot of the information we're piecing together through a marine science program that we've developed the last 3 years in the Department of Fish and Game is that first 2 to 3 months out at sea is critical towards determining the fate of these salmon as they come back as adults. And we're very interested in learning in an area like the Kenai River, where we're having poor production, what impact that nearshore marine environment in Cook Inlet may or may not be having on long-term king survival and return rates.
Thank you. And the last question is actually related to the last, or to your response to the last. As the water's warm, what effect is that having on the 2-year freshwater salmon fry? Are they leaving the rivers earlier? And if so, what effect does that have on their ocean survivability?
I think I answered part of that question, but clearly as the ocean's warm, king salmon are not the winners in the ocean. I think we're finding out in general that king salmon, as the ocean warms, their energy demands go up, and the food that they're eating out in the ocean is probably not as energetically nutritious as it was in the past. So overall, what we're seeing across Alaska's river systems are king salmon are coming back earlier, younger at age. So we used to have 5- and 6-year-old, 7-year-old fish. Now they're 3-, 4-, and 5-year-old fish. They're coming back smaller at age, which means that each age class that comes back is a smaller fish than it used to be, and they're coming back fewer in number. You know, everything, when you piece those puzzle pieces together, everything is pointing to the fact that the ocean is not a good place to be if you're a Chinook salmon. We know that as temperatures rise, their energy demands go up, and that's a difficult thing, so they need to eat more food. But we also know there's a lot more marine mammals out in the ocean than there was a decade ago. Some people estimate that the number of marine mammals is 4 or 5 times what it was a decade ago. Now that's good from an ecosystem perspective, but those things do eat a lot of different things, including Chinook salmon and the prey that are important to Chinook salmon. So we are committed at the department to expanding our marine science program that looks at that nearshore marine environment, as well as committing to working with international bodies on further work that may be undertaken to evaluate the deep blue ocean sea, including subsequent things that are going on with the International Year of the Salmon. So,
thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for this panel. Thanks for taking the tough questions. Well, that's the last of our 3 topics for today. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Alaska State Governor Mike Dunleavy. I want to say that, as you may or may not know, I'm from California. I'm 66 years old, and I've never met a sitting California governor. So the accessibility of your governor here is to be commended.
We could take a picture and you can send it to your governor.
I'll also mention that your governor is far more favorable to salmon than ours is. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. I've never met your governor either, but I read a lot about him. Anyway, well, once again, I want to thank Krista and all the folks associated with fish in the state of Alaska and that are here today. I was talking with our friend Merle here earlier that Alaska is fish, and fish is Alaska. I mean, it was fish that really catapulted us into a state because of the federal management issues that we had seen before statehood. And the changes made as a result of that increased our stocks of fish. And as mentioned, I'm not going to go over all the things that you talked about, but you know, it's an ebb and flow issue with some of our fish. We're having some difficult times with king salmon, for example, on the Yukon, as was mentioned. We see tremendous runs of reds in parts of the state as well. And our chums and our silvers, we're keeping an eye on that because in some places the runs were not as strong as they once were. The question is, what is this going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15, 20 years? It's going to be pretty dynamic. You know, as Doug mentioned, the temperatures in the ocean, certain temperatures and certain blobs in certain areas at certain times, certainly going to have an impact on the fish. Some of it will be negative, some of it may be positive, we'll have to see. But I think what we're going to do, you know, what we want to do, all of this, is really understand what's happening out there. Really understand it. We know that politics play a role in fisheries. It's just the way it is. It plays politics in fisheries all over the world. But here in Alaska, I think we've done a pretty good job historically in trying to manage based upon the data and based upon the science. So as we go into the budgetary session, for example, budgetary season and policy season, which happens in the administration starting about this time into October, because we have to prepare our budgets for December, one of the things that we will be talking about is research, types of research that we need to take a look at. And I know that one of the topics that was discussed really has to do with obstructions in the water, new things being placed in the water, whether it's offshore wind, whether it's potential tidal apparatus out here in Cook Inlet. Could be even new ports, new harbors. What's the impact? What will be the impact on fish in general, but in many cases, salmon specifically because of the way they move through the freshwater, saltwater, back and forth? How is this going to impact our salmon going into the future? There's a lot of things we know. There's a lot of things we don't know. And so what we want to try and do is get answers to the things that we don't know so we can predict better what's going to happen, whether it's water temperature, whether it's food sources, whether it's potential obstructions, whether it's offshore wind apparatus, tidal apparatus, activity within the inlet, activity in other parts of Alaska, to try and capitalize on some of these new technologies for energy. You know, the Kenai was at one time the economic heart of the state of Alaska with the LNG terminal, with the fertilizer plant. Nikiski was a powerhouse. Well, you're right on Cook Inlet. You're right on the salmon runs. You're right on the what at one time and hopefully will be the greatest salmon runs in the world, King Salmon Run, for example, for king salmon as well as others. And so we just have to keep on things. We have to keep on the research. We have to keep the discussions going. There's a lot of competition, as we know, between the different user groups. But hopefully what we all have in common is we want more fish for Alaska. We want more fish in the rivers. There's a political part of it, as I mentioned, but really I think what we need to do is become leaders in the science and the data and really hone down on what it looks like now, what the history tells us, and what we can predict which in the future, which could be a chaotic future. It could be a chaotic future. I don't need to mention, you know, the Japanese are contemplating, it looks like they made a decision to start to release some of that water from Fukushima into the oceans. What's the impact that will be? They hope it's negligible. We'll find out. Again, we don't know what the temperature, what the situation is with the temperatures in terms of long-term impact on our fisheries. And then, of course, we have in-water issues that we always have to keep an eye on. So we'll have discussions with representatives of the groups here. We'll have discussions with Doug and his team. And we'll have discussions with science across the country, across the world, to come up with the best plan to ensure that Alaska maintains its role as the premier fishery on the planet. And I think we have that opportunity to do it, to really lead in this across the world. And so that'll be our goal this year, as it should be our goal every year. I just want to thank everyone for being part of this, for taking the time to be down here today. For those that are going to study and watch what was discussed here today, but also as we move forward. As was mentioned, you're going to have a cycle on a board meeting that will impact Cook Inlet, that will impact Cook Inlet for the next several years. I'm going to ask all Alaskans. You know, we do a lot of working each other over, okay? It's just the way we do it in politics, especially fish politics and other types of politics. But we all work together. If we can come around some common understandings on data, on science, on runs, et cetera, it's going to serve us all well for the future. And so I think our goal is to make sure that we have the strongest fishery in the world, we have consistent and sustainable runs well into the future, and that we can hand off to our kids and our grandkids the greatest fishery on the planet. So that should be our goal. But again, welcome, thank you, thanks for all your hard work, and I guess we'll see some of you in and out around maybe a couple boats here in the next couple days. But again, it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to speak in front of you. And just want to thank everyone. And we are missing somebody this year, as we know. It was mentioned that Bob has passed away, Bob Penny. And this was a big project of his. And again, the work that we do will not just honor him, but importantly, honor our future generations. So with that, I want to thank you. And let's get more fish in the rivers. Let's get more fish in Alaska. Thank you. When are you going to move here? Yeah, okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Governor Dunleavy. I want to take this opportunity to again thank the sponsors, Yamaha and Dow, for sponsoring the Kenai River Classic. This concludes the roundtable, and those of you who are participating and registered in the Classic, you have the rest of your agenda. So thank you very much.